Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to take a look back at what happened in Week 8 of the 2022 season of the Overwatch League. It was the second week of qualifiers for the Midseason Madness. And oh boy, was it a rough week for me. Let's pull up what happened this week. 9-7 overall, very weak. Just over 500 pick rate. And 0-2 on big picks. Very much struggling with big picks this season. I am swinging and missing on a lot of these. You can see what I picked, who I picked, where things went wrong, went right, whatever. All that laid out in front of you. So let's jump in and let's talk about some of the matches that we had. Probably trying to run through them pretty broadly, talk about teams, matches, whatever, like I normally do. Nothing too in-depth. This time around, unless it's a matchup I think is pretty important to talk about in depth. The LA Valiant were victorious over the Philadelphia Fusion. It's the first time they beat the Philadelphia Fusion since 2018. So, been a long time since the Valiant beat the Fusion. But it's a good win for them. Reverse sweep, which is even more kind of impressive. Very rough week for the Fusion. 0-2 for them. Two games they probably should have won, or should have been. I mean, they lost to the Hunters, so it's not that big of a surprise. The Valiant game they should have won, but they just fell apart in the second half of the series, couldn't get it done. Valiant played pretty well. They're doing everything they can to get themselves in position to potentially make a run at the Midseason Madness. There's a lot of competition for that kind of number 4 spot. The Valiant are still a little bit of a ways off because the Fusion, despite the fact that they're not playing well right now, do have those additional points from the kickoff clash. So even with the same record, the Valiant wouldn't be able to pass the Fusion. They basically have to have they have to have 2 more wins than the Fusion do to make it all the way, which is tough for them for sure. But overall, pretty good showing from them. Definitely impressed with what I saw from the Valiant this weekend. Just Fusion did not look very good. Seoul Dynasty victorious with the Chengdu Hunters. This is another close series. It was 3-2. I kind of was amazed at how close it ended up being, but ended up going the way of the Dynasty. Dynasty been looking pretty good still, coming out their kickoff clash success. So good for them. I'll talk more about them later, as I will with the Hunters too. New York Excelsior took on the London Spitfire. Wasn't even a close series. Spitfire were pretty dominant. It was a 3-1, I think. It was not close. New York is an embarrassment of a team, and I don't want to talk about them, so we'll move on. Spitfire, though, good win for them. Trying to solidify their spot in the Midseason Madness. Obviously, they're playing behind the 8 ball a little bit because they don't have the extra points that teams like the Mayhem and the Defiance and the Justice and the Reign have, who are all kind of around them in terms of their record and the Outlaws. But they do have a lot of wins under their belt. The Spitfire looking pretty good right now. This tournament cycle is not too hard for them, so I think they will be playing in the Midseason Madness. They definitely look good. This win over New York, though not a tough opponent, definitely helps them get where they want to be, so big win for them. Exciting to watch them. They're looking a lot better over time. They're really integrating Poco into the roster as well. They're definitely finding ways to do a lot of different things well, so pretty impressed with this roster. Dallas Fuel beat the Florida Mayhem. Good showing from the Fuel this weekend. They got 2 wins. Wasn't the toughest opponents. It was the Mayhem and the Titans, but they 3-0'd the Mayhem, which was a bit of a surprise, and a lot of people, myself included, thought this series could be pretty close. Ended up being a very one-sided affair for the Fuel, which is about what I expected from them. I mentioned I didn't expect them to struggle this weekend the same way they did last weekend. Last weekend they played 2 very good opponents. I think there was a lot of questions about things they had to figure out in terms of them coming back from the kickoff clash, meta adjustment. They struggled against 2 really good teams, but they looked very good this weekend. They looked back in form. Mayhem had a tough weekend. I ended up with the Fuel and the Shock, and they did not really impress me that much in this tournament weekend because they just really struggled against some good teams. I think the Mayhem are a pretty middling team. I don't really think they're all that good. They're not bad, but they're definitely on the lower half, in my opinion, of some of those teams in this Region right now, I don't think they look to be in that upper echelon. I think they're better than Defiant right now. I don't think they're better than the Spitfire. I wouldn't put them ahead of the Rain or the Outlaws or the Fuel, Gladiator, Shock. So they're kind of in that category where they're like around Spitfire, Defiant, Justice. They're in that kind of category. I think that they're struggling a bit. I think that they have the flexibility. I just think that they really are getting to a point where their roster strength is getting to be the thing that is going to hold them back the most. They have some talent, but I don't think they have the pure talent that teams like, Dallas, San Francisco, even Houston and the Gladiators have, where it's just like really powerful rosters, and then like the Rain have it. They just don't seem to have that same kind of killer instinct. They make a lot of mistakes. Someone goes to aggressive, Sir Majed goes to aggressive, they get isolated, picked off, stuff like that. Happens quite a bit with this team, and I think that that's one of the things they need to work on and fix, is toning back some of their aggression and figuring more out where they want to go beyond that, and kind of how to slow down, how to play more together as a team. Because they've shown some signs of promise, but this weekend was rough for them. But it's two good opponents, so it's hard to really take too much away from that. Rain Titans was a win for the Rain, not really surprising. It was a bit of a struggle for them. The Titans, I actually think, looked pretty good this weekend. They didn't win a game this weekend, so it's one of those things where it's really tough to be like, well, how could they look good if they didn't win a game? But I always think with a team like Vancouver, who are struggling and who have just been at the bottom and have had to play a lot of really good teams this tournament cycle in particular, it is so good to see where this team is at and how they are doing so far. They're improving a lot. Obviously, not going to show up much in results in this tournament cycle. We've talked about this in the past. I think that the Titans' chances of winning games are not going to be in this tournament cycle. Maybe they manage to steal a win somewhere, but it's unlikely. But I'm really excited to see what they do when we get into the Summer Showdown, how they look then. Because to me, the bottom kind of half right now is definitely like doable, right? They can beat Paris and New York and Boston, and they can beat Washington. They can beat Defiant the way they're playing right now. So that puts them kind of in contention with teams like London and Florida potentially. Vancouver might not be at the level yet of those teams, but then they're getting there based on what we've seen. So it's been a tough weekend for them. It's hard to really kind of gauge where they're at when you're kind of playing the top upper level teams and you're looking like decent. I'm really excited for them to play some weaker opponents soon. I don't remember who they play next week, but I know this tournament cycle is really brutal for them, where they don't play like a single team with a, in the bottom half or with like a, not even a losing record, but like a record towards the bottom. I mean, next week they have to play the Shock, which is just not fair. And then to close off the tournament, they played the Justice, which is definitely a winnable game. That's definitely their next winnable game. And that's how they end this tournament cycle. It's a game against the Justice. So they have a chance definitely to win that game. That's the one I'll be kind of keeping my eyes on. But right now, I wouldn't really put the Titans as a team that's been doing a lot. Rain, this was a questionable performance. It looked okay, but they played a much bigger game later on in the week and didn't do very well, so we'll talk about them more then. Saturday was a rough day for me. I had 2 games right, and everything else was wrong. 2 for, 6? 2 and 4. Rough day for me. Hunger Spark beat the Guangzhou Charge. Not that surprising of a result. The Spark actually look pretty good right now. They look to be on the up. Obviously, they had a weak performance in the Kickoff Clash tournament itself. They had a great qualifiers, not a great tournament, but this week they looked pretty good. And that is something that I was pretty impressed by, seeing the way that they performed. So definitely something that I am curious to kind of see where they keep going from here. The Spark are a good-looking team. I think they have the talent we know they have. When they can play their best, they look really, really good. They're very consistent. I want to see them get more consistent. Maybe that'll be something that we see more of as the team itself kind of plays together longer. 2019, they were a team that looked pretty weak early on, and then by the end of the season were like a pretty solid, formidable opponent. They weren't world beaters by any means. They were good. They were solid. they're already off to a better start than they were back then, and I think if the trajectory they're on right now continues, they could definitely be one of the top teams in the region coming into the end of the season. They look pretty solid right now. I mean, they only have one loss in the regular season, and it was that loss to the Shanghai Dragons back in the kickoff clash. There's a 3-2. Like, this is a Spark team that, you know, they obviously disappointed losing to the Fusion, losing to this whole Dynasty. That was definitely disappointing when they lost in the tournament, but I think it'll be interesting to see them play in a Midseason Madness where they get to play teams from the West, and so there's a bit more potential for them to do something more when they don't necessarily have to play some really elite level competition at all points in time. There's 8 teams from the West that make it, so the chances are, if they're one of the top teams in the APAC region, which right now they are, they might get to pick a lower level opponent from that Western region, and that could hopefully give us a better look where the Spark are as a whole, because they've had some good results here in the APAC region, so we'll see more, but we'll talk about them later as well. The Charge had a really bad weekend. They did not win either of their games. They're the weakest team in this region. That is, that's pretty obvious at this point in time, so not that surprising, but I want to see more from them, especially they've made some changes. Obviously, got rid of Eileen, they got rid of Molly. Double Flex Sports the meta now, so they kind of look stupid doing that. And especially when the Valiant picked up Molly, and he did a pretty good performance against the Charge. I think Farway did a little bit better in some situations, but I thought Molly had a very good weekend. Against the Fusion, he was really, really good, so kind of funny. But yeah, they're the weakest team in this region, so not that surprising that they lost. I think they should probably pick up a Prita, but we'll see what happens. Seoul Dynasty beat the Shanghai Dragons. That was one of my big picks. I picked the Dragons to win this one because they had been very consistent against this Dynasty team. The Dynasty's win in the kickoff clash was the first time they'd beaten the Dragons in like 2 years. It was the only, you know, they were 1-2 on the season already against the Dragons. So to me, it was believable to think that the Dragons were the better team. No. The Dynasty were dominant in this game. It was a 3-0. Dragons had some moments that I was just like watching the Dynasty just actually pound this Dragons team. Dynasty looked so good, and it wasn't just, you know, profits that we've seen for the majority of the time for this team so far this season. It was mostly Stalker and Stalker and Prophet, and they both looked very, very good. And of course, Stalker we haven't really seen yet this season, and he played very well. So I was very impressed by this team as a whole. I thought they looked pretty good, kicking off where they were with their kickoff clash performance, picking right back up from where they were. Definitely still look to me like the best team in this region. Definitely want to see them play the Spark again. I think that'll be an exciting matchup. But Dynasty look really, really good right now. Big weekend for them. Definitely still one of my picks to win out of this Eastern region. I don't know if they're the best team in the league right now, but they certainly have an argument for it. Chengdu Hunters beat the Philadelphia Fusion. Fusion had a rough weekend. Definitely a team that looks to kind of be falling apart. But it's the Fusion. We kind of expect that from this Fusion roster. That's just what the Fusion are. That's their organization. I don't know how they manage this all the time. It's wild, man. I don't know what the Fusion are doing. I don't know what deity they sold their soul to disappoint their fans all the time, but it was a rough weekend for them. Definitely would hope to see more out of them going forward. A little disappointing overall, but I think that the Fusion still have a lot of potential. They still look good. Against the Valiant, they had moments where they looked very good with Bellisria, and they didn't really play Fury this weekend. I don't think they played him at all, which was surprising when Sigma's been getting a lot of playtime. Though Wrecking Ball is also getting a lot of playtime, so kind of realistically kind of makes sense. And they played Gaga, who's a very good ball, so I'm curious to see what happens. The Fusion go up against some better teams. Of course, they have to play the Dragons again this tournament cycle. They're 2-0 against Dragons so far. Dragons are struggling, so which of those two teams pulls it out? They'll have a game against the Charge going up. But, the rest of their games are the Charge, and then the Dragons, the Spark, and the Dynasty. They have to play the three teams ahead of them in the standings and the team in last place. So they'll be interesting to watch. Rough weekend from them. I thought that they just looked to be struggling to kind of stay coordinated. I thought that the supports were not having their best performance so far. It was a tough game to kind of watch against the Valiant because they just fell apart in the second half. They should have had that series. It should have been a 3-0, and they just couldn't do it. So I'm concerned about this team. But Chengdu, we saw some Jinmu Tracer. That was interesting to see them actually run like Tracer and Sojourn, which is the meta. And we saw Jinmu on Tracer. We also saw someone like Pharah and stuff. But maybe the Hunters are more flexible than I gave them credit for. I still don't think it's great, but maybe, just maybe, I was a little too harsh on this team. Let's go to the West for Saturday. Defiant beat the Justice. I mean, come on, it's Defiant and the Justice, man. Who knows? I didn't learn anything from this game. The Defiant looked good. The Justice looked bad. But it's the Defiant and the Justice. They're both. That's literally both of these teams' identities. They're good. They're bad. They're good. They're bad. It doesn't matter. Justice definitely on the lower end right now. They have to clean up some of their play. Definitely curious to see what happens. Vigilante is able to play. I think he comes of age soon. I don't remember exactly when. I mean, they are potentially not going to make it to the Midseason Madness because they are struggling right now. Their record is dropping. But Vigilante becomes of age July 1st. So next or this coming Friday, he comes of age. So he might be able to. So he could play this weekend coming up. So definitely potential for this team to have some turnaround with Vigilante coming of age. But definitely some concerns on my end for this team based on what we've seen from them. Like I said, they play Vancouver at one point in time. That can help them potentially find a win. They do play the Gladiators this weekend, which is rough. They play the London Spitfire, which is winnable, depending on how they are. But, then they have to play the Titans, and that is the end of their qualifier. So they definitely could go 2-1 the last couple games, and then it's kind of up to points at that point in time. If they're tied with the Spitfire on record, they would get in because they have the additional point, stuff like that. We'll see what happens with them, but I have some concerns for them. Defiant, I don't really think are that good. These are two teams that I think are both struggling, and we'll see what happens over time. The Defiant, I think, are going to be okay, but I don't think they're anything special right now. I mean, they're behind London. They're a little ahead of Florida right now in the standings just because they've played fewer games. Their differential is not as good as Florida, so we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with this team. It's interesting. Shock beat the Reign. Not that surprising. I thought the Reign would win. I thought Kai played very, very well. Shock were pretty dominant in this series. Reign did not look very good. I think the Shock are just very good right now. I think this meta works for them. Obviously, they can play double flex support incredibly well. Mikey's Wrecking Ball has been really, really good. They can play the Sigma if they need to put Collusion. I think they fix a lot of their problems. I think the meta works very well for them. They don't really play out of Sojourn, which is interesting, but they don't really need to because they do really well with like Sam on the Hanzo and Proper playing whatever he wants to play. I think they definitely look better this tournament cycle than they did last tournament cycle. I thought that they looked good last tournament, but this time around I think they feel more comfortable. I don't have those same concerns about flexibility with them because Mikey brings so much to the table. Double flex sport's been really, really good, so they can get away with kind of where they are with their roster lineup. So very impressed with this Shock roster. They were dominant in this game and against the Mayhem, so good for them. Reign, Venom did not look as great. They struggled quite a bit. I think it's really one of those things where they seem to kind of start off strong in metas, hit like a rough patch in the middle, and then they kind of pick it up towards the end. So we'll see what happens in the Midseason Madness itself with this Reign team, but they don't look great right now. We'll see. I think that they definitely are still a talented roster, and Kai Sojourn is so good that I think that he can still figure things out, but he didn't look as good this weekend. I think that was one of the reasons why they struggled as much as they did. Fuel with the Titans, talking about these two teams already. Good win for the Fuel, good weekend from them, but I believe they went 6-0 on maps. Titans are still struggling, but I think they're getting there. Same as I said before with these teams. Valiant beat the Charge, not a huge surprise. Valiant are better than the Charge right now. Definitely good for the Valiant to see them improving. They've moved from, they were in last place going into the final week of the kickoff clash, and they've moved up into 5th. So moved up 2 spots in 2 weeks of play. So that's good for them. I believe they're 3-0 in their last 3 games, which is pretty impressive. 3-game winning streak for them. Valiant, not a team to write off. I think Marvel looks really good. I think he really was kind of my standout performer for the weekend. Obviously, a lot of stuff going on with this team to get Marvel, but it was worth it because he put on an incredible performance this weekend, and I think that you have to really look at the Valiant as a potential team to really make a potential late season dark horse run in this APAC region because they look pretty good right now. So see what happens. Hangzhou Spark beat the Shanghai Dragons 3-0. There was a good old Shang 9 in this one. It was a rough game for the Shanghai Dragons. A rough weekend for them. Definitely my team that disappointed me the most this weekend. I really don't know what it is. Fully, I think they're a team that are in a weird place because they were so good last season. They don't look as good this season. I don't know what really is the problem. We haven't really seen them play any of that full roster from last season. Last meta, they ran a whole bunch of Who Are You with the occasional Fleta. In this meta, they're playing a lot of Bebe and they're not playing Lee Jae-gon. So maybe they just have to get back to playing what they played before. But I don't think that them switching one piece out is the thing that's the problem. I think they just look not as good. I think some of the metas aren't necessarily as good for them. I wonder if the lack of Sombra has kind of hurt Lip a bit. Lip is obviously a hit scan player, can play some other roles, but I think his Sombra was just so dominant that really was what the team played around. And I don't know if they're struggling to kind of figure out where to go now. A lot of different questions. I'm kind of curious to really dive into the Shanghai Dragons roster more and see where they're at and what their problems are, because they just rough weekend from them, rough season honestly. 5-3 with a -2 differential. When they lose, they've been losing bad, right? They have they have 2 3-0 losses of the Fusion, a 3-0 loss of the Spark, a 3-0 loss to the Dynasty. I mean, their losses are bad. And their wins aren't great either. Their wins are mostly close 3-2 brawls. So I don't have a lot of confidence in the Dragons team right now because they don't have that killer instinct they had in the past, which is quite concerning when you think about how good this team was just a year ago, and they don't have it now. So very concerning on my end for this Dragons roster. Finally, Western Region on Sunday. Shock beat the Mayhem. Not that surprising. Mayhem looked okay. They looked decent at times, but it wasn't you expected them to lose. It was respectable, but that was about it. That's kind of where things went wrong for them, was the fact that they had to play the Shock. So it is what it is. LA Gladiators beat the Houston Outlaws. The Gladiators, as good as the Shock look, I still think the Gladiators are the best team in this region because they can play anything. They can play double flex support just like the Shock can. Reiner can play everything in the tank role, so you have what you need. They have pretty much equal DPS flexibility, and I think that just pound for pound, roll for roll, I think that the Gladiators are just slightly better. Proper is definitely the best DPS player between these teams, but I think that Ants, when it comes to Ants versus Kilo, very, very close, but maybe the edge to Ants. I think Potifon has looked better so far. I don't know if you put Proper and Kevster or Proper and Potifon, but I'd say that Potifon has looked better than Sam has. And then Proper and Kevster are 2 of the best DPS players in the world right now. So really interesting to me. Outlaws, I think, are in an interesting spot because the Doomfist looks pretty good right now. So they, in theory, should be pretty good. But I don't think that Dante is kind of setting the world on fire on Doomfist like he was when he first rolled out with it. It looks okay. It doesn't look amazing anymore. So we'll see what happens. But I'm not as intrigued by this roster as I was at the very beginning. They look kind of right now. I think they're okay. But they definitely could have some pretty interesting looks going forward. They're still doing well in the season. They only have 3 losses on the season, which is pretty impressive. So oh no, they're still pretty good, but Gladiators are so good, and I still think they're the best team at least in the region, potentially in the league right now. Final match of the weekend, Boston Uprising put the hurt on the Paris Eternal, winning 3-0. I expected or thought that the Eternal would win, and they didn't even look that good. But it's been quite the journey watching this Boston team go pretty up and down, but they definitely are solidifying themselves as kind of the upper echelon of this lower level of teams. Maybe even potentially moving into that same tier with teams like the Justice and the Defiant and the Mayhem. We'll see what happens when they play teams in that level. But winning 3-0 against the Paris Eternals is a pretty statement win, in my opinion. Pretty much solidifies them in a separate tier from those teams, or at the very least kind of firmly at the top of that tier. So we'll see what happens going forward. These are two teams that I think are both interesting, and it's difficult to gauge where they're at because they kind of are playing very specific opponents. And when they play each other, it's hard to kind of gauge when you have two teams in the lower end where they are when they play better teams. So it's interesting. I'm curious to see what happens going forward. But all in all, happy with the Uprising to get a win. They've had a lot of stuff go on this season, and happy to see them get a W where it matters. So that's a pretty long one. Let's quickly just throw up the standings. You can see them right here. There's some things on this one that might differ from the league's website, but I generally look at their tiebreaker rules for what I want to do for my own standings. So take that as you will. This is based on what the league gives me information-wise. That's going to be all, though, for me for today. If you stuck through this one, thank you. I know it was a long one, but, you know, sometimes it has to be that way. If you enjoyed this video and would like it in the future, consider liking and subscribing. Comment down below your thoughts on what happened this past weekend. Obviously, I had a rough weekend. I did not pick well, so call me an idiot down there if you want to. I don't really care. That's going to be all from me for today. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.